Good evening and welcome to Nighttime Biographies. Tonight we travel back to Victorian England to follow the remarkable life of Charles Dickens, a boy who knew poverty and hardship firsthand, yet grew to become one of the most celebrated writers of his age. Imagine a boy of 12, standing at a wobbling table beside a grimy window overlooking the River Thames, pasting labels onto pots of boot polish for 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. Imagine that this same boy would grow up to become the most famous writer in the English-speaking world, a man whose stories would be read aloud in parlours from London to Boston, whose characters would become so real to readers that strangers wept in the streets when one of them died on the page. Imagine that the boy who once believed his family had abandoned him to a life of poverty and shame would one day dine with queens, and that the very shame he carried in silence for 30 years would become the hidden engine of nearly everything he ever wrote. This is the story of Charles Dickens. Picture a man who left school at 12, yet became one of the most quoted authors in the history of the English language. Picture a child who watched his father dragged away in a debtor's cart, yet grew up to entertain heads of state. Picture a writer so beloved that when he died, flower sellers in Covent Garden tied black ribbons to their baskets, and children in the poorest corners of London were said to have asked through tears, "Mr. Dickens dead? Then will Father Christmas die too?" How does a boy born to modest, financially reckless parents, a boy who spent his most formative months not in a schoolroom but in a rat-infested warehouse, rise to become the conscience of an empire? That is the question this story will try to answer, gently, across the winding path of a single remarkable life. Before we go further, if you find comfort in these long, calm biographies, consider settling in for tonight's journey. And if you enjoy this kind of storytelling, subscribing helps more of these come your way. But for now, let us leave the noise of the city behind and travel back nearly 200 years to a small house near the naval dockyards of Portsmouth, England, where our story quietly begins. Portsmouth, in the winter of 1812, was a town that smelled of tar and salt water. Britain was at war with Napoleon's France, and the dockyards rang day and night with the sound of hammers on timber, the shouts of riggers, the creak of great ships being built and repaired for His Majesty's Navy. It was a town of comings and goings, of sailors' wives waiting at windows, of taverns full of talk about battles fought an ocean away. The streets were narrow and busy, lined with modest brick houses that leaned gently toward one another as though sharing secrets. In one of these houses, a small terraced home on Mile End Terrace, lived a young clerk named John Dickens and his wife, Elizabeth. John worked for the Navy Pay Office, a respectable position that placed him solidly among the lower middle class of English society, a class that valued appearances, propriety, and the careful management of one's reputation. Unfortunately for John Dickens, the careful management of money was not among his talents. He was, by every account that has survived him, a warm, sociable, generous man, fond of good food, good company, and grand speeches delivered with theatrical flourish. He loved his family. He simply could not, for the whole of his life, live within his means. Elizabeth Dickens, born Elizabeth Barrow, came from a family with its own complicated relationship to money and respectability. Her father had once held a comfortable position, but had fled to the Isle of Man years earlier under suspicion of embezzlement, a family shadow that would echo, in strange and unexpected ways, through the life of the grandson she would soon bear. Elizabeth herself was intelligent, quick with languages, and possessed of a lively sense of humour that her son would later inherit and transform into something extraordinary. She was, by most accounts, a devoted mother, though history would remember her most vividly for one particular decision made years later, a decision her famous son never fully forgave. On the 7th of February 1812, in the upstairs bedroom of that small Portsmouth house, Elizabeth Dickens gave birth to a son. They named him Charles John Huffam Dickens, the middle names honouring a family friend, a wealthy godfather whose fortune the family perhaps hoped might one day benefit the boy, though it never did. Charles was the second of what would eventually be 8 children, though not all of them would survive to adulthood, a sorrowful commonness of the era that touched nearly every family, rich or poor. The infant who arrived that February morning was, by his mother's later description, a delicate child, thin and watchful, prone to the kind of stomach ailments that kept him close to home while other children played in the streets. Nobody watching that small, quiet boy in his cradle could have imagined that his name would one day be spoken in nearly every household in England, that streets would eventually be renamed in his honour, that his birthday would be marked by literary societies on multiple continents for centuries after his death. The house on Mile End Terrace was modest but comfortable in those early years. John Dickens's naval clerk's salary, while never quite sufficient for his ambitions, provided the family with servants, a garden, and a respectable address. It was briefly a happy home, but happiness of that particular financially precarious kind rarely lasts, and even before young Charles could form his earliest memories, the family's fortunes had already begun the slow, uneven decline that would define his childhood. Elizabeth Dickens, in the earliest months of her second child's life, faced the ordinary but demanding rhythms of caring for an infant in a household already balancing genteel aspiration against modest means. John Dickens's work with the Navy Pay Office required occasional relocation as the Napoleonic Wars continued to shape the demands of naval administration, and the young family's earliest years together were consequently marked by a certain amount of movement and instability, a foreshadowing, though nobody could have recognised it as such at the time, of the far more serious instability that would come to define much of Charles's later childhood. Still, in these earliest years, the family remained financially comfortable enough to maintain the outward markers of respectability that mattered so much to Victorian and pre-Victorian English society. A servant or two, proper church attendance, and a home address that reflected favourably on the family's position. By 1814, when Charles was 2 years old, the family moved again, this time deeper into Portsmouth, and then, in 1815, to London itself, where John Dickens took up a new post. London in those years was the largest city in the world, a churning, smoking, endlessly fascinating metropolis of nearly 1.5 million souls, a city of extraordinary wealth pressed up hard against extraordinary poverty, often on the very same street. It was a city that would, in time, become as much a character in Charles Dickens's novels as any person he ever invented. But that recognition lay decades in the future, for now London was simply a strange and enormous new world for a small boy still learning to walk steadily on his own 2 feet. In 1817, when Charles was 5 years old, the family relocated once more, this time to Chatham, a town in Kent built around another great naval dockyard, much like Portsmouth had been. It was here, in Chatham, amid the green fields and old castle ruins of the Kent countryside, that Charles Dickens later said his conscious childhood truly began. The years in Chatham, roughly from age 5 to age 10, would remain in his memory as the golden years, the years he would return to again and again in his fiction, transformed and disguised but always recognisable to those who knew his history. The house the family occupied in Chatham, on Ordnance Terrace, was larger and more comfortable than anything they had known in Portsmouth. There was a garden. There were fields nearby where a small boy could wander. There was, most importantly for the development of the future novelist, a modest library, containing works by Tobias Smollett, Henry Fielding, Miguel de Cervantes, and a collection of stories known as the Arabian Nights. Charles, delicate in health, and often kept indoors while his more robust siblings played outside, found in these books a doorway into other worlds, and he walked through that doorway again and again, reading and rereading the same small collection of novels until he had, by his own later admission, practically memorized them. He was, in these years, a small, watchful, imaginative child. Contemporaries who knew the family described him as bright-eyed and curious, prone to standing on tables and chairs to perform recitations and songs for visiting relatives, already, even before he could properly spell many of the words he used, displaying the theatrical instincts that would later make him not only one of history's great novelists, but also one of its great public performers. His father, for all his financial failings, possessed a natural gift for oratory and storytelling, and young Charles absorbed this gift the way a child absorbs a language spoken in the home, without ever quite realizing he was learning it. There was in Chatham a particular walk that father and son took together, out past the town toward a grand house called Gads Hill Place, visible on a rise in the distance. According to a story Dickens told throughout his life, his father pointed to the house one day and told young Charles that if he worked hard enough and was a good and industrious boy, he might some day come to own such a house himself. It seemed at the time an impossible fantasy, the kind of thing fathers say to children to encourage good behaviour, never meant to be taken literally, and yet, remarkably, decades later, it would come entirely true in a way that still moves those who study his life. But that triumph lay very far ahead, across a valley of hardship that neither father nor son could yet see. Charles began attending a small school in Chatham, run by a young Baptist minister named William Giles, and here for the first time his natural intelligence was formally recognised and encouraged. Giles saw something unusual in the boy, a quickness of mind and a hunger for words that exceeded his years, and he took a particular interest in his education, an interest that Dickens remembered warmly throughout his life. Giles, recognising the unusual quickness of his young pupil, lent Charles books beyond his years and encouraged the kind of independent reading and recitation that had already begun at home, further deepening the boy's growing love of language and storytelling. Fellow students remembered Charles, even at this young age, as a natural entertainer, someone who could hold a room's attention with an invented story or a well-performed recitation, a gift that seemed to come to him as naturally as breathing, though he himself, in later years, always insisted that whatever talent he possessed had been built through patient observation and effort, rather than any inborn genius, a modest, if not entirely accurate self-assessment from a man whose gifts would eventually prove almost without parallel in English letters. These were by every measure good years. The family was not wealthy, but they were comfortable. The children were fed, clothed, and for the most part, happy. It seemed to a boy of 7 or 8 that this state of affairs might continue indefinitely. It did not. There were other pleasures too, small and specific, the kind that lodge themselves permanently in a child's memory long after larger events have faded. There was the annual fair that came through Chatham, with its travelling performers, its painted booths, its smell of gingerbread and trampled grass, a spectacle young Charles watched with the same rapt, absorbed attention he brought to everything that captured his imagination. There was the sound of the dockyard itself, the great naval guns being tested, the shouts of workers, the endless procession of ships being built, launched and repaired, a soundscape of industry and ambition that surrounded the boy from his earliest conscious years and perhaps planted in him some of the restless, driving energy that would characterize his entire adult life. There were the old ruins of Rochester Castle nearby, and the great cathedral, both of which Dickens would return to again and again in his later fiction, transformed and reimagined but always recognizable to those who knew the geography of his childhood. He had in these years a sister named Fanny, older than him by about a year, with whom he was particularly close, and the two children were often found together, inventing games, performing little plays for the amusement of visiting relatives, or simply wandering the fields and lanes around Chatham on long summer afternoons. Fanny possessed genuine musical talent, and the family, with characteristic optimism about their prospects despite their modest means, eventually arranged for her to study at the Royal Academy of Music in London, an opportunity that would not, in these same years, be extended to Charles, a disparity that some biographers believe left a quiet, lasting mark on the young boy, who watched his sister pursue formal artistic training, while his own education remained comparatively haphazard and dependent entirely on his family's uncertain finances. Despite these small inequities, the Chatham years remained, in Dickens's own later recollection, something close to an idyll, a period of relative safety and wonder before the harder realities of the world began pressing in. He would walk with his father past the grand house at Gads Hill, would sit for hours absorbed in his small library of novels, would perform his recitations for delighted relatives, and would explore the countryside with Fanny and his other siblings, entirely unaware that this comfortable, secure version of childhood was rapidly approaching its end. What he could not know, as he wandered those green Kentish lanes, was that his family's finances, quietly crumbling beneath the surface of their outward respectability, would soon force a change that would strip away nearly everything familiar and comfortable about his young life. John Dickens's debts, quietly accumulating beneath the surface of the family's comfortable appearance, had by 1822 grown too large to manage any further in Chatham. That year, the family was recalled to London, and the golden Kent years came to an abrupt and permanent end. 10-year-old Charles, we're told, was left behind briefly with his teacher to finish out a term of schooling, and when he finally rejoined his family in London, he found them living in far humbler circumstances than he had known before, the first unmistakable sign that something in the fabric of his childhood had begun, quietly and irrevocably, to tear. The London that the Dickens family returned to in 1822 was not the London of grand terraces and naval respectability that young Charles had glimpsed as a toddler. It was a London of narrow lanes and shabby lodgings, a London where a once comfortable clerk's family could slide, almost without noticing the individual steps of the descent into genuine poverty. John Dickens, transferred to a new position with reduced prospects and burdened by debts he had never managed to shake, moved his family into a small, cramped house in Camden Town, a modest and somewhat disreputable district on the northern edge of the city. For young Charles, not yet 11 years old, the change was disorienting and painful in ways his parents seemed slow to recognise. Gone were the fields and the library and the encouraging schoolmaster of Chatham. In their place was a household under mounting financial pressure, parents distracted by worry, and gradually the disappearance of the small comforts that a child takes for granted. His formal schooling, so promising under William Giles, simply stopped. Nobody arranged for him to attend a London school. Instead, he found himself increasingly useful around the house, running errands, pawning small family possessions at the request of his parents, becoming in effect a miniature adult navigating the pawnshops and second-hand dealers of a struggling household. Consider what this meant for a boy of 11, sensitive and bookish, who had until recently imagined himself destined for a proper education and a respectable future. Consider the particular loneliness of watching one's family possessions, book by book, disappear from the shelves to be sold for a few shillings, while nobody explained clearly what was happening or why. Years later, in fragments of autobiography that he shared only with his closest friend and later biographer John Forster, Dickens described this period as a time when he felt himself slipping quietly out of the world of educated, respectable boys and into something else entirely, something he could not yet name but which frightened him. The house on Bayham Street, where the family lodged in Camden Town, stood in a modest, somewhat run-down neighbourhood, quite unlike the comfortable, semi-rural streets of Chatham. Dickens later described the surrounding area with an unmistakable note of remembered gloom, the small gardens gone to weed, the general sense of a neighbourhood in gentle, persistent decline, matching all too closely the trajectory of his own family's fortunes during this period. His mother, ever hopeful of finding some solution to the family's mounting difficulties, attempted at one point to open a school for young ladies in a rented house, an ambitious scheme that ultimately attracted not a single pupil, a small, quiet humiliation that young Charles observed with the same attentive, absorbing eye he brought to everything around him, filing away the particular pain of watching a parent's earnest hopes come to nothing. Meanwhile, the family's few remaining comforts continued to disappear. Charles was frequently sent on his father's instructions to sell or pawn books, furniture, and household items, developing in the process an intimate, uncomfortable familiarity with the pawnbrokers and second-hand dealers of the neighbourhood, men whose faces and shops he would later render with vivid, unmistakable precision in his fiction. He absorbed during these errands the particular etiquette and shame of poverty in a status-conscious society, the careful negotiations, the practised excuses, the small indignities that a boy raised to consider himself a young gentleman found especially difficult to bear. What he could not know, as he trudged through the pawn shops of Camden Town on his parents' errands, was that this humiliation was only the opening note of a far deeper crisis, one that would arrive within the year and mark him, by his own account, for the rest of his life. The seeds of catastrophe had been planted long before, in debts owed to a wine merchant, in bills that John Dickens had signed and could not honour, in the particular financial recklessness that seemed woven into his very character, despite his genuine love for his family. By early 1824, those debts had grown beyond any hope of quiet management. A 12-year-old boy, watching his father's increasingly strained face across the dinner table, could sense that something terrible was approaching, even if he did not yet have the words for it. In February of 1824, just days before Charles's 12th birthday, a decision was made that would haunt him for the rest of his life, one that he would keep almost entirely secret from the world, sharing it with only his wife and his closest friend, and only revealing it to the public in fictionalized form decades later in the pages of a novel called David Copperfield. A distant relative of the family, a man named James Lamert, was connected to a business called Warren's Blacking Warehouse, a factory near the Thames that manufactured and bottled boot polish. It was arranged, with what Dickens later remembered as shocking casualness, that young Charles would go to work there, pasting labels onto pots of blacking for 6 shillings a week, a wage meant to help support the struggling family. He would not attend school. He would instead stand for 10 hours a day at a table near a window looking out over the river, in a decaying, rat-infested building, alongside other working boys of similarly reduced circumstances, performing the same repetitive, unskilled labour day after day after day. Imagine being 12 years old, a child who only recently dreamed of continuing his education, of becoming a scholar or a gentleman, suddenly finding himself among boys who called him the young gentleman, with a mixture of curiosity and mockery, because his manner and speech still carried traces of a better upbringing than theirs. Imagine the particular shame of walking past the windows of the warehouse, visible to passers-by on the street, knowing that anyone who glanced in might recognize him, might see exactly how far the family had fallen. Dickens later wrote, in that fragment of unpublished autobiography, of the secret agony of my soul during this period, of how he felt utterly and completely abandoned, his hopes of becoming a learned and distinguished man crushed beneath the weight of a boot-polish label and a paste-brush. What made the wound cut even deeper was what happened just weeks after Charles began this work. His father, John Dickens, was arrested for debt and taken to the Marshalsea prison, a debtors' prison on the south bank of the Thames, the very institution that would later provide the setting and inspiration for Dickens's novel Little Dorrit. Under the law of the time, debtors could be imprisoned until their debts were paid, and their families were permitted, though not required, to live with them inside the prison walls. Elizabeth Dickens and most of the younger children did move into the Marshalsea alongside John, turning imprisonment into a strange, cramped sort of family life within stone walls and locked gates. Charles, however, was not brought to live with them. Instead, he was lodged separately, in a rented room with a family friend, and continued each day to walk to the blacking warehouse, working his 10-hour shifts, then walking, in whatever time remained, to visit his family at the prison. Picture this 12-year-old boy's daily rhythm. Rising alone in a rented room, walking through the London streets to a job that filled him with shame, labouring for hours among boys he felt himself socially above, and yet was now, in practical terms, exactly equal to, and then walking to a prison to see his parents and siblings, only to walk back alone again each night to his lodgings. Here was a boy who had once been told he might own a grand house on a Kentish hillside, who now could not be certain where his own family would sleep from month to month. Here was a child of unusual intelligence and sensitivity, forced into the coarsest kind of factory labour at the exact age when his education should have been deepening rather than ending entirely. This paradox, this violent collision between promise and degradation, became, in the view of nearly every biographer who has studied his life, the single most formative experience Charles Dickens ever endured, the wound from which nearly all of his greatest fiction would eventually flow. The blacking warehouse period lasted, by most careful accounts, somewhere between 4 and 6 months, though to young Charles it felt, he later said, like years without end. Year after year, or so it seemed to a child's altered sense of time, he pasted labels, folded paper wrappers, and watched the river traffic through the grimy window, wondering if this would be the whole of his life. Lesser spirits might have surrendered entirely to despair. Something in Charles Dickens, some stubborn ember of self-belief that even he could not fully explain in later years, refused to be extinguished. John Dickens' imprisonment ended in May of 1824, after a small inheritance allowed him to settle his debts, and the family was released back into the world. One might expect that Charles's ordeal at the warehouse would have ended immediately upon his father's release. It did not. In a decision that wounded Charles more deeply than the warehouse work itself, his mother argued that he should continue working there for a time, to help the family's finances continue to recover. It was, in the end, John Dickens who insisted his son be removed from the warehouse and returned to school, a fact that shaped Charles's lifelong complicated feelings toward each of his parents, feelings of forgiveness and gratitude toward his father despite his failings, and feelings of quiet, unresolved hurt toward his mother that never fully healed. even decades later, even after fame and wealth had made the entire episode seem, to outside eyes, like ancient and irrelevant history. Consider, too, the particular boys who worked alongside young Charles at the warehouse. Boys named Bob Fagin and Paul Green, among others, whose names Dickens remembered with striking precision even decades later, an indication of just how deeply this brief period had etched itself into his memory. Bob Fagin, in particular, treated young Charles with unexpected kindness during this difficult time, on one occasion caring for him personally when he fell ill at the warehouse, an act of ordinary working-class decency that Dickens never forgot, and which he later honoured in his own peculiar way by giving the surname Fagin to one of literature's most memorable villains in Oliver Twist, a naming choice biographers still find curious and worth pondering, suggesting perhaps some complicated blend of affection and darker association in Dickens's memory of those months. The warehouse itself stood in a decaying old building near the Strand, overrun by rats whose scurrying and squeaking punctuated the long working hours, its ancient wooden floors and staircases rotting in places, water seeping through in wet weather. Dickens later described, with unusual precision for memories he otherwise tried to suppress, the exact appearance of the room where he worked, the crazy, tumble-down look of the place, the dirt and decay pressing in from every direction, details that suggest just how completely this environment imprinted itself on a sensitive, observant boy already developing the powers of description that would later make him famous. He worked alongside boys considerably rougher in manner and background than himself, and though he later insisted he never felt himself superior to them in any meaningful moral sense, the class distinction between his own family's aspirations toward respectability and the working-class world of the warehouse created a persistent, uncomfortable friction that never fully resolved itself during his months there. Sundays offered brief respite, the one day when Charles could walk further afield, sometimes visiting his family at the Marshalsea for longer stretches, sometimes simply wandering the London streets alone, observing the city that would later become so central to his fiction, absorbing details of shop fronts, street vendors, and passing crowds that would resurface, transformed, throughout his novels for decades afterward. Even in the depths of this humiliating period, the same observant, story-hungry mind that had devoured novels in the Chatham library continued quietly working, cataloguing details, imagining narratives, even if the boy himself could not yet have predicted what he would eventually do with this accumulating store of observation. He returned to school in the autumn of 1824, enrolling at the Wellington House Academy in London. But something had changed in him permanently. He never spoke of the blacking warehouse to his own children during his lifetime. He kept the fragment of autobiography describing it locked away, sharing it with only his closest friend. And yet, in nearly every novel he would eventually write, the theme would resurface again and again. The neglected child, the imprisoned father, the shame of poverty pressed against the dream of a better life, the particular terror of a bright, sensitive child cast adrift in an indifferent world. The wound never fully closed. Instead, with remarkable and mysterious alchemy, it became the deepest source of his art. The Wellington House Academy, where Charles resumed his education at 12 years old, was by his own later account an unremarkable institution, its headmaster prone to harsh discipline, its academic standards modest at best. But for Charles, simply returning to a classroom after the warehouse felt like an enormous gift, and he applied himself with an energy and enthusiasm that his classmates remembered vividly even decades later, when journalists came asking about the school days of England's most famous author. He organised amateur theatrical productions among his fellow students, wrote and produced small comic plays, and edited a homemade newspaper that circulated informally among his friends, early signs of the storytelling and performing instincts that had never actually left him, only gone briefly underground during his months at the warehouse. His formal education ended for good in 1827, when Charles was 15 years old, a typical age for a boy of his social class to leave school and begin working. His first job was as a clerk in a law office, a position secured through family connections, where he spent long hours copying legal documents and observing, with the sharp and sceptical eye that would later serve him so well as a novelist, the peculiar rituals, delays, and absurdities of the English legal system, a system he would later satirize mercilessly in novels like Bleak House. The law, he decided fairly quickly, held no appeal for him as a career. What did interest him, increasingly, was journalism. With characteristic determination, the teenage Charles Dickens taught himself shorthand, a difficult and demanding skill involving a complex system of symbols that allowed a skilled practitioner to transcribe spoken words nearly as quickly as they were uttered. He practiced obsessively by his own later description, treating the mastery of shorthand as a kind of personal proving ground, a way of demonstrating to himself and to the world that the boy from the blacking warehouse could still achieve something remarkable through sheer force of will and effort. By the time he was 18, he had become skilled enough to work as a freelance court reporter, transcribing proceedings at the ecclesiastical courts of Doctors' Commons, and soon after, he moved into parliamentary reporting, sitting in the press gallery of the House of Commons, capturing the debates of the nation's leading politicians with remarkable speed and accuracy. These years as a young reporter, roughly from age 18 to his early 20s, gave Dickens something invaluable, an intimate first-hand understanding of how power actually operated in England, how politicians spoke in public and behaved in private, how the machinery of law and government often ground along slowly and self-servingly, while ordinary people's lives hung in the balance. He travelled around the country covering elections and political events for various newspapers, observing the full theatre of English public life with an eye that missed nothing, storing away details, characters, mannerisms, and turns of phrase that would resurface, transformed, in his fiction for decades to come. It was also during these years that Charles experienced his first serious heartbreak, falling deeply in love with a young woman named Maria Beadnell, the daughter of a banker who considered the young reporter, still without fortune or established career, an entirely unsuitable match for his daughter. The relationship, pursued with the same intense, almost desperate energy that Charles brought to everything he cared about, ultimately ended in painful rejection, a wound that stayed with him for years and that he later transformed, with characteristic alchemy, into fictional material, most notably in the character of Dora in David Copperfield. Consider what this rejection meant to a young man already carrying the secret shame of the blacking warehouse. Another door closed, another reminder that his social position remained precarious, that talent and effort alone might not be enough to secure the life he wanted. But even as this personal disappointment weighed on him, Charles's writing ambitions were beginning to take a new and unexpected shape. Alongside his journalism, he had begun, almost as an experiment, to write short humorous sketches of London life, observing the city shopkeepers, clerks, cab drivers, and eccentric characters with a combination of comic exaggeration and genuine affection. In December of 1833, one of these sketches was published in a magazine, and seeing his work in print for the first time, Dickens later said, moved him to tears of joy as he sat reading it in a coffee shop, so overcome with emotion that he had to walk the streets for half an hour to compose himself before he could return to his desk. During these same years, Charles also continued to nurture a secondary passion that had never entirely left him since his childhood recitations in Chatham, amateur theatre. He seriously considered at one point in his early 20s pursuing acting as an actual career, going so far as to arrange an audition with the manager of a London theatre. On the appointed day, however, Charles was suffering from a severe cold and was forced to postpone the audition, and by the time he'd recovered, his growing success as a writer had begun to seem a more promising path forward, a small twist of fate that biographers have often noted with interest, wondering how differently the history of English literature might have unfolded had that cold not intervened. Though he ultimately chose writing over a formal acting career, the theatrical instinct never left him, resurfacing throughout his life in his amateur theatrical productions, his eventual public readings, and even in the vivid performative quality of his prose itself, which often reads as though intended to be spoken aloud rather than silently absorbed on the page. It was also during this period of rising literary success that Charles began to more actively cultivate friendships within London's literary and artistic circles, connections that would prove important both personally and professionally throughout the remainder of his career. He grew close to figures including the illustrator George Cruikshank, who provided artwork for some of his early publications, and gradually built a network of professional relationships with publishers, editors, and fellow writers that would support and sustain his career for decades to come. His work as a parliamentary reporter also introduced him, during these years, to the broader world of London journalism and publishing, connections that would prove invaluable once he began seeking outlets for his own original writing. He worked for a succession of newspapers, earning a reputation among editors and fellow reporters as one of the fastest and most accurate shorthand transcribers in London, a skill that, combined with his naturally quick and retentive memory, allowed him to produce transcripts of parliamentary debates with a speed that genuinely impressed his colleagues. Year after year, through his late teens and early 20s, he built this reputation, all while nursing, in whatever spare hours remained, his growing ambition to become something more than a skilled transcriber of other men's words. This modest publication marked the true beginning of Charles Dickens the writer, though nobody, least of all Charles himself, could have predicted at that moment just how extraordinary and rapid his rise was about to become. The sketches continued, appearing under the pen name Boz, a nickname derived from a mispronunciation used by one of Charles's younger brothers, and gradually building a small but devoted readership. In 1836 these pieces were collected and published as a book, Sketches by Boz, illustrated by the well-known artist George Cruikshank, and though modest in its initial success, the collection caught the attention of a publishing firm that was about to offer Charles Dickens the opportunity that would change his life forever. The sketches themselves, observant, funny, occasionally tender portraits of ordinary Londoners going about their daily business, revealed a young writer already possessed of an unusually sharp eye for the small telling details of human behaviour, the particular walk of a self-important clerk, the exact tone of voice used by a gossiping neighbour, the quiet dignity of a struggling shopkeeper, details that would soon expand into the fully realised characters that made his novels so beloved. The publishers Chapman and Hall approached the 24-year-old writer with an unusual proposal. They wanted him to provide comic text to accompany a series of illustrations by a well-known artist, depicting the misadventures of a group of London gentlemen belonging to a fictional sporting club. Dickens, with characteristic confidence, insisted on reversing the usual arrangement, proposing instead that the illustration should follow his text rather than the other way around, and that the story should follow its own comic logic rather than being dictated by predetermined images. The publishers agreed, and the result, released in monthly instalments beginning in March of 1836, was the Pickwick Papers. The early instalments sold modestly, a few hundred copies each. But something remarkable happened over the following months. Word of mouth began to spread. Readers fell in love with the bumbling, good-hearted Mr. Pickwick and his companions, with the comic servant Sam Weller, whose sharp Cockney wit made him an instant sensation when he was introduced partway through the series. By the time the final instalment appeared in November of 1837, sales had climbed to an astonishing 40,000 copies per issue, an almost unheard of figure for the time. Charles Dickens, not yet 26 years old, had become, within the span of a single year, the most talked-about writer in England. Consider the sheer speed of this transformation. Only 12 years earlier, he had been a shamed 12-year-old pasting labels in a blacking warehouse, uncertain whether his family would ever recover its footing. Now streets were said to fall quiet on the days when new instalments of Pickwick appeared in shop windows, as readers rushed to buy their copies. Pickwick-themed merchandise appeared. Hats, walking sticks, cigars, even a stage adaptation performed without Dickens's permission, a common practice of the era that frustrated him throughout his career. The word Pickwickian entered the English language as a term of good-humoured, slightly bumbling benevolence, and it remains in dictionaries to this day. Dickens did not slow down to savour this success. Instead, with an energy that would characterise his entire working life, he began writing his next novel, Oliver Twist, even while Pickwick Papers was still being published, sometimes working on both simultaneously within the same week, a punishing schedule that he maintained in various forms for most of his career. Oliver Twist, published in instalments beginning in 1837, marked a significant departure in tone from the broad comedy of Pickwick. Here was a darker story, following an orphan boy through the workhouses, criminal underworld, and back alleys of London, a story that drew directly, though in disguised and transformed fashion, on Dickens's own childhood fears of abandonment and poverty. The novel's unflinching depiction of the workhouse system and the criminal exploitation of children shocked and moved readers across England, forcing a genteel Victorian readership to confront realities of urban poverty that many had preferred not to examine too closely. It was, in many ways, the beginning of a pattern that would define Dickens's entire career: entertaining stories, filled with comedy and warmth and unforgettable characters, that nonetheless carried within them a serious moral urgency about the treatment of the poor, the vulnerable, and the forgotten members of English society. In April of 1836, in the midst of all this professional upheaval, Charles Dickens married Catherine Hogarth, the daughter of a newspaper editor he had come to know through his journalism work. Catherine was gentle, good-natured, and by most accounts genuinely devoted to her husband in these early years. The couple would go on to have 10 children together over the following 2 decades, and their early married life, though increasingly overshadowed by Dickens's relentless work schedule, began in a spirit of genuine affection and hope. Tragedy struck the young household just over a year into the marriage, when Catherine's younger sister, Mary Hogarth, who lived with the couple, died suddenly and unexpectedly at the age of 17, collapsing in Dickens's arms after an evening at the theatre. Dickens was utterly devastated by her death, more profoundly affected by some accounts than by almost any other loss in his life. He wore a ring of hers for the rest of his days, and later requested, though it was not granted, to be buried in the same grave. Mary's memory, idealized and transformed, would echo through many of the pure, innocent young female characters who appear throughout his novels, including Little Nell in The Old Curiosity Shop and, in certain respects, Agnes in David Copperfield. To understand Charles Dickens, one must understand not only what he wrote, but how he lived, day by day, for the whole of his adult career. By the late 1830s and through the 1840s, a routine had crystallised that would remain, with only modest variations, the rhythm of his entire working life. He rose early, generally around 7 or 8 in the morning, and after breakfast with his family, he retreated to his study, where he worked with remarkable, almost military discipline from roughly 9 until 2 in the afternoon, 5 days a week. Visitors who called during these hours, no matter how important, were turned away without exception. The work came first, always. His desk was arranged with peculiar precision. Certain ornaments had to sit in exact positions. Pens had to be a particular type. Blue ink was required rather than black, and he wrote on blue-tinted paper a set of small rituals that biographers have suggested helped calm and focus a mind that was, by every account, extraordinarily restless and energetic. After his writing hours ended each afternoon, Dickens transformed into an entirely different sort of man. He was, throughout his life, an enthusiastic and tireless walker, often covering 10, 15, even 20 miles through the streets of London or the countryside surrounding his various homes, walking at a fast, purposeful pace that exhausted companions half his age. These long walks served a double purpose. They provided the physical exercise that balanced his sedentary morning work, and they gave him the opportunity to observe London's streets, characters, and daily dramas first-hand, gathering the raw material that would later populate his fiction. He was known to walk late into the night as well, particularly during periods of restlessness, or when working through a difficult plot problem, sometimes covering enormous distances well after midnight while the city slept around him. In appearance, Dickens was of medium height, slender in his younger years, though he grew somewhat stouter in middle age, with a mass of dark, wavy hair that he wore fashionably long and a neatly trimmed beard and moustache that he adopted in his later years. His eyes were frequently described by those who met him as remarkably bright and penetrating, seeming to notice everything, missing no detail of dress, gesture, or expression in the people around him. He dressed, throughout his adult life, with notable flamboyance for the era, favouring brightly coloured waistcoats, elaborate cravats, and rings on his fingers, a style that some considered slightly vulgar for a man of letters, but which Dickens embraced without apology, a small, visible echo, perhaps, of the theatrical instincts he had carried since childhood. His personality, by nearly universal account, combined enormous warmth and generosity with an equally enormous, restless, sometimes exhausting energy. Friends described him as the most entertaining company imaginable, a brilliant mimic, a gifted amateur actor, endlessly inventive in devising games, charades, and theatrical productions for family and friends, particularly around Christmas, a holiday he loved with genuine passion, and which he did more than perhaps any other single individual to shape into the modern, family-centred celebration we recognise today. He loved animals, kept a series of beloved dogs and a raven named Grip, that partly inspired Edgar Allan Poe's famous poem, and delighted in elaborate practical jokes and amateur theatrical performances that he organised among his circle of literary and artistic friends. His homes, over the years, reflected this same combination of order and exuberance, whether at Doughty Street in his early married years, at Devonshire Terrace during the height of his early fame, or later at Tavistock House, and finally Gads Hill Place. Dickens filled his residences with books, curiosities, and mementos gathered from his travels, arranged with the same meticulous attention he brought to his writing desk. He was known to rearrange furniture obsessively when something felt slightly wrong to him, and household staff learned quickly that certain small details, the placement of a particular ornament, the exact angle of a mirror, mattered to their employer in ways that might have seemed excessive to an outside observer, but which seemed, to those who knew him well, simply another expression of the restless, controlling energy that also produced his extraordinary creative output. At the dinner table, Dickens was, by every account, a magnificent host, delighting in good food and good conversation, though he himself ate and drank with more moderation than many of his contemporaries assumed given his robust public persona. He loved to organise elaborate games after dinner, charades and guessing games that could stretch on for hours, with Dickens himself often taking the most theatrical and demanding roles, throwing himself into invented characters with the same total commitment he brought to his fiction. Christmas at whichever house the family currently occupied became, over the years, a legendary annual event among his circle of friends, filled with games, songs, elaborate decorations, and the kind of warm, inclusive festivity that Dickens had done so much to popularise through his own writing. He maintained an enormous correspondence throughout his life, writing thousands of letters to friends, family, fellow writers, editors and admirers, letters that reveal, perhaps more intimately than any other surviving record, the full range of his personality. Witty, generous, occasionally sharp-tongued when provoked, endlessly curious about the world around him, and almost always, even in his most private correspondence, aware of himself as a kind of performer, crafting even his personal letters with an eye toward their rhythm and effect. He was a devoted, if sometimes overwhelming, father in his children's early years, inventing games, organising elaborate seaside holidays, and taking obvious delight in the noise and chaos of a large household, though as the demands of his career grew, his direct involvement in his children's daily upbringing gradually diminished, a common pattern among prominent Victorian fathers of his era, though one that some of his children, in later years, remembered with a degree of wistfulness. Yet beneath this warmth ran a current of genuine restlessness that never fully settled. He needed activity, needed audiences, needed the sense of forward motion, whether through his writing, his walking, his amateur theatricals, or later in life his public readings. Friends and family sometimes found this energy difficult to match, and there was, running through even his happiest years, a sense that Charles Dickens was a man who could never quite sit still long enough to feel entirely at peace with himself, a restlessness that some biographers have traced directly back to the unresolved trauma of those months in the blacking warehouse, when a bright and sensitive boy learned that the ground beneath his feet could shift without warning and perhaps never fully trusted solid ground again. Through the 1840s and into the 1850s, Charles Dickens entered the period that most literary historians regard as the height of his creative powers, producing, in astonishingly rapid succession, many of the novels that remain his most beloved and enduring works. In 1843, seeking to address the harsh economic conditions and widespread poverty he observed around him, and perhaps also seeking a quick and reliable source of income after a period of disappointing sales for his novel Martin Chuzzlewit, Dickens wrote A Christmas Carol in a burst of intense creative energy over roughly 6 weeks in the autumn of that year. The story of the miserly Ebenezer Scrooge, visited by 3 spirits who show him the consequences of his hardened heart, was an immediate and overwhelming success upon its publication just before Christmas, selling out its first printing within days. The book crystallized, in a single unforgettable narrative, Dickens's deepest moral convictions, that generosity, warmth, and human connection mattered more than wealth accumulated for its own sake, and that redemption remained possible for even the most hardened heart, so long as one was willing to truly see the suffering of others. The impact of A Christmas Carol extended far beyond its immediate commercial success. Historians and cultural scholars alike have credited the book, along with Dickens's broader body of work, with playing a genuine and measurable role in reviving and reshaping the celebration of Christmas in England, emphasizing family gatherings, charitable giving, and warm domestic celebration over the more subdued observances that had become common in preceding decades. The phrase "Merry Christmas," while it existed before Dickens, became closely associated with the spirit of generosity and goodwill that the book so memorably championed, and the name Scrooge itself entered the English language as a permanent synonym for miserliness, a linguistic legacy few authors in history have achieved. Dickens followed A Christmas Carol with several more Christmas books in subsequent years, though none achieved quite the same lasting cultural impact. Meanwhile, his major novels continued to appear at a remarkable pace. Dombey and Son, published between 1846 and 1848, explored themes of pride, commerce, and paternal coldness through the story of a wealthy merchant obsessed with his business legacy at the expense of his relationship with his children. It represented, in the view of many critics, a maturing of Dickens's craft, showing greater structural sophistication and psychological depth than his earlier, more episodic novels. Between Dombey and Son and David Copperfield, Dickens also continued producing his annual Christmas books, shorter works released each December that, while never matching the singular success of A Christmas Carol, remained eagerly anticipated by his enormous readership and further cemented his association with the holiday season in the public imagination. Titles including The Chimes, The Cricket on the Hearth, and The Battle of Life explored similar themes of redemption, generosity, and the transformative power of compassion, each finding its own devoted audience, even as critics debated whether any could truly match the lightning-in-a-bottle achievement of his first and most beloved Christmas story. Then, in 1849 and 1850, came what many consider Dickens's most deeply personal work, David Copperfield. Written in the first person, an unusual choice for Dickens, the novel followed its title character from a troubled childhood, complete with a period of degrading factory labour strikingly similar to Dickens's own blacking warehouse experience, through education, early heartbreak, and eventual success as a writer. For the first time, though still carefully disguised behind fictional names and altered circumstances, Dickens allowed the deepest wound of his own childhood to surface directly in his published work. He later called David Copperfield his favourite child among all his novels, and readers and critics alike have long recognised it as the novel in which Dickens came closest to directly confronting and perhaps partially healing the trauma that had shaped him so profoundly as a boy. The 1850s brought further masterpieces. Bleak House, published in 1852 and 1853, offered a sprawling, structurally daring critique of the English legal system, centred around an interminable lawsuit that consumes and destroys the lives of nearly everyone connected to it, drawing directly on Dickens's early experiences as a law clerk and his lifelong contempt for the law's capacity for cruel, grinding delay. Hard Times, published in 1854, took aim at the dehumanizing effects of industrial capitalism and utilitarian philosophy, set in a fictional northern mill town, and in 1857 and 1859 respectively, Little Dorrit and A Tale of Two Cities appeared, the former drawing directly and unmistakably on Dickens's memories of his father's imprisonment in the Marshalsea. the latter offering a sweeping historical drama set against the backdrop of the French Revolution, opening with perhaps the most famous first line in the English language. "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times." Between these major novels, Dickens also pursued an active career as an editor and magazine proprietor, founding and running successive weekly periodicals, first Household Words and later All the Year Round, through which he published not only his own serialized fiction, but also work by other rising writers of the era, along with journalism, essays, and short stories addressing social issues close to his heart. These editorial responsibilities added yet another demanding layer to his already extraordinary workload, requiring him to review submissions, manage staff, negotiate with printers, and maintain a weekly publication schedule, even while simultaneously drafting his own novels in monthly or weekly installments. Few writers in history have sustained such a combination of creative output and practical business management across so many years without any apparent diminishment in quality, and this sustained productivity remains, to literary historians, one of the more remarkable aspects of his career. His novels from this period also increasingly showcased his gift for social panorama, weaving together multiple plot lines and social classes within a single sprawling narrative in ways that captured the full complexity and interconnectedness of Victorian society. Bleak House, in particular, is often cited by literary scholars as a structural masterpiece, alternating between a first-person narrator, the modest and warm-hearted Esther Summerson, and an unusual sweeping third-person voice that ranges freely across London, connecting aristocrats, lawyers, street sweepers, and forgotten orphans within a single vast web of consequence and coincidence, all ultimately entangled in the same interminable lawsuit. This structural ambition reflected a writer at the absolute height of his creative confidence, no longer simply telling engaging stories in serial installments, but constructing entire fictional worlds of remarkable scope and moral complexity. Throughout this extraordinary creative period, Dickens maintained his punishing writing schedule, typically producing novels in monthly or weekly installments that required him to think constantly, months in advance, about pacing, cliffhangers, and the delicate balance between satisfying immediate reader demand and maintaining coherent long-term structure. It was, in essence, a form of storytelling that demanded he live inside multiple imagined worlds simultaneously, while also managing an increasingly complex professional and personal life, a level of sustained creative output that few writers before or since have managed to match. It would be a mistake to think of Charles Dickens purely as an entertainer, however brilliant his gifts for comedy, character, and narrative invention. Running through nearly every novel he wrote was a fierce, unwavering moral seriousness about the conditions of England's poor, and Dickens used his enormous fame and readership as a platform for social reform in ways that few novelists, before or since, have managed with comparable impact. He had witnessed poverty firsthand, both in his own childhood and in his ongoing observations as a journalist and walker of London streets, and he never lost his sense of outrage at the way Victorian society often treated its most vulnerable members, particularly children. His novels repeatedly expose the brutal conditions of workhouses, the exploitation of child labour, the corruption and inefficiency of legal and governmental institutions, and the hypocrisy of a society that professed Christian charity while tolerating extraordinary levels of urban squalor and suffering. Oliver Twist's unflinching portrait of workhouse cruelty, Nicholas Nicklby's exposure of abusive boarding schools, Bleak House's indictment of legal delay, and Hard Times' critique of dehumanizing factory conditions all reflected a consistent, deeply felt moral vision. Dickens did not confine his social conscience to fiction alone. He gave public speeches advocating for causes including improved sanitation, education reform, and the abolition of public executions, which he witnessed firsthand and wrote about with visceral horror at the crowd's carnival-like enthusiasm for the spectacle of death. He worked closely for many years with the wealthy philanthropist Angela Burdett Coutts, one of the richest women in England, whom he had come to know socially, and whose genuine commitment to charitable causes matched his own on a range of charitable projects, most notably helping to establish and personally oversee a home called Urania Cottage, designed to help former prostitutes and women in desperate circumstances rebuild their lives through education and preparation for emigration and new beginnings abroad. He personally interviewed prospective residents, helped design the home's daily routines, selected furnishings, established rules for daily conduct, and remained involved in its operations for over a decade. A level of hands-on commitment to charitable work that went well beyond simply writing checks or lending his famous name to a cause. Consider what drove this sustained practical commitment to social reform in a man who could easily have rested on his literary fame and considerable wealth. The answer, most biographers agree, traces directly back to that boy in the blacking warehouse, to the terror of abandonment and poverty that Dickens carried with him his entire life, transformed now into fierce, productive advocacy on behalf of others who faced circumstances he himself had once endured. He never forgot, and he seemed determined that his readers should never forget either, that behind the statistics of Victorian poverty were real children, real families, real human suffering that demanded not merely sympathy but action. Beyond Urania Cottage, Dickens involved himself directly in numerous other reform efforts throughout his career. He toured slum districts and prisons, both in England and during his travels to the United States, documenting conditions with a journalist's precision and a novelist's emotional insight, publishing his observations in essays and travel writings that reached wide audiences. He campaigned actively for improved sanitation in London's poorest neighbourhoods, understanding, well ahead of much official medical opinion of his day, the direct connection between overcrowded, unsanitary housing and the disease outbreaks that regularly devastated poor communities. He supported ragged schools, informal institutions that provided basic education to children too poor to attend regular schools, visiting them personally and writing about their importance in reaching children who might otherwise never learn to read at all. He was also outspoken, sometimes controversially so among his more conservative contemporaries, in his criticism of institutional charity that he considered more concerned with appearances and administrative self-importance than genuine help for the poor, a theme he explored with particular sharpness in his portrait of the well-meaning but ultimately neglectful philanthropist Mrs. Jellyby in Bleak House, a character so consumed with distant charitable causes that she entirely neglects her own suffering children at home. This satirical edge reflected Dickens's consistent conviction that genuine compassion required direct, personal engagement with real suffering rather than abstract self-congratulatory gestures at a comfortable distance. This moral seriousness did not come at the expense of his famous humour and warmth. Rather, the two qualities existed side by side throughout his work. Comedy and outrage intertwined, laughter and social critique working together to make his message accessible to the widest possible readership. It was, perhaps, this particular combination, entertainment married to genuine moral purpose, that made Dickens's social criticism land with an impact that dry statistical reports or earnest reform pamphlets could never achieve. Readers who might have turned away from a lecture on workhouse conditions instead found themselves weeping over the fate of Oliver Twist, and in weeping they were moved, in ways both large and small, toward greater sympathy and, in some documented cases, toward genuine political and social action. For all his professional triumphs during the 1840s and 1850s, Charles Dickens's personal life during these same years was gradually, quietly beginning to fracture in ways that would eventually become public and painful. His marriage to Catherine, which had begun in genuine affection, grew increasingly strained as the years passed. 10 children, born over roughly 15 years, had taken a considerable physical and emotional toll on Catherine, who by several accounts struggled with what might today be recognised as postpartum depression following several of the births, and who found it increasingly difficult to keep pace with her husband's relentless energy, his demanding social calendar, and his growing fame, which brought with it an endless stream of admirers, correspondence, and professional obligations. Dickens, for his part, grew increasingly critical of Catherine in private correspondence during these years. Complaints about her supposed clumsiness, her lack of enthusiasm for activities he loved, a coldness that seems, from the vantage point of history, deeply unfair to a woman who had borne him 10 children while managing an increasingly complex household under the strain of his celebrity. The precise causes of the marriage's deterioration remain debated among biographers, but most agree that a significant factor was Dickens's growing involvement, beginning around 1857, with a young actress named Ellen Ternan, whom he met while directing and performing in an amateur theatrical production. Ellen was 18 years old at the time. Dickens was 45. The exact nature of their relationship over the following years remains even now a subject of historical debate and careful scholarly investigation, complicated by Dickens's determined efforts, largely successful during his lifetime, to keep the matter entirely private. What is clear is that Ellen Ternan became an important ongoing presence in Dickens's life for the remainder of his years, and that his marriage to Catherine could not survive the strain. In 1858, Dickens and Catherine separated, an event that, given his enormous public profile, could not remain entirely private despite his best efforts at discretion. He published a public statement addressing rumours about the separation, a decision that many friends, including some of his closest literary collaborators, felt was a serious error in judgment, unnecessarily airing what should have remained a private family matter, and one that reflected poorly on his treatment of Catherine, whom he described in less than generous terms. The separation caused a rupture with several of his oldest friends, including the illustrator who had worked with him for years, and strained his relationships with some of his own children, several of whom remained emotionally close to their mother, despite living, by arrangement, primarily with their father. Catherine, for her part, left comparatively few written records defending herself or explaining her own experience of the marriage, a silence that historians have long found significant in itself, suggesting either a genuine reluctance to publicly criticize her famous husband or, perhaps, a deep and long-nursed private grief that she chose never to share with the wider world. She moved into a separate residence following the separation, received a settlement that ensured her financial security, and maintained contact with several of her children, though the arrangement, dictated largely by Dickens himself, kept her apart from the daily life of the family in ways that must have caused her considerable pain. She lived for many years after the separation, long enough to see her husband's continued fame grow even further, and reportedly kept, until her own death, letters he had written her during their courtship, tied together with a note expressing her wish that the world should one day know how much he had once loved her. Dickens's relationship with his own children during this period grew similarly complicated. Several of his sons struggled to find stable careers or direction in life, a source of ongoing worry and at times visible disappointment to their famous, relentlessly industrious father, who seemed to struggle with understanding children whose temperaments differed so markedly from his own driving ambition. His daughters, particularly Mamie and Katie, remained closer to him throughout these years, with Katie in particular developing into a talented painter and maintaining a complicated but genuinely loving relationship with her father until his death, later becoming, along with her brother Henry, one of the family's most valuable sources for biographers seeking to understand the private man behind the public literary giant. It is worth pausing here to consider the complexity of this period without either excusing or condemning Dickens too simply. Here was a man whose entire moral vision, expressed across novel after novel, centered on compassion, forgiveness, and the protection of the vulnerable, and yet whose treatment of his own wife during their separation showed, by most modern assessments, a marked lack of exactly those qualities. It is a genuine contradiction, one that biographers continue to wrestle with, and one that reminds us that even the most morally serious and publicly beloved figures remain, in their private lives, complicated and imperfect human beings, capable of real kindness and real harm, sometimes within the very same period of their lives. Despite the personal turbulence of these years, Dickens's professional energy never flagged. If anything, he threw himself into new projects with even greater intensity during this period, as though outrunning his private difficulties through sheer force of continued activity, a pattern that would define much of the remainder of his life. Beginning in the mid-1850s and accelerating through the 1860s, Charles Dickens discovered a new and, in some ways, even more direct form of connection with his enormous readership. Public readings of his own work, performed before paying audiences with the same theatrical skill and instinct he had displayed since his childhood days of reciting for family visitors in Chatham. What began as occasional charity readings evolved, by 1858, into professional commercial reading tours that took Dickens across Britain and eventually to the United States, where he performed before enormous, enthusiastic crowds in cities up and down the eastern seaboard. He would stand alone on a stage before a specially designed reading desk of his own precise specification, and perform, essentially from memory, carefully edited and condensed versions of his most beloved works. The Death of Little Nell, The Christmas Transformation of Scrooge, The Murder of Nancy from Oliver Twist, a scene of such visceral, terrifying intensity and performance that Dickens himself worried it might be too much for some audience members, and indeed, by some accounts, several people fainted during particularly intense performances of this reading. These readings were, by every account from those who witnessed them, absolutely mesmerizing theatrical events. Dickens did not simply read his text aloud. He performed it, shifting voices for different characters with remarkable skill, using his whole body, his famous expressive eyes, his carefully trained voice to bring his fictional creations to vivid, immediate life before audiences who had, in many cases, spent years imagining these same characters purely through the printed page. Contemporary accounts describe audiences moved to tears, to helpless laughter, to genuine terror, sometimes within the span of a single evening's performance. The public readings brought Dickens enormous additional income, considerably more, in fact, than his writing alone had ever generated, and they satisfied something in his restless, performance-hungry temperament that even his prolific literary output could not fully address. But they also exacted a tremendous physical toll. The demanding tour schedules, sometimes involving performances nearly every night for weeks or months at a stretch, combined with extensive travel across difficult terrain and, particularly during his American tours, harsh winter conditions, began to wear seriously on a man now well into his 50s, whose health, by several medical accounts, had never been especially robust. The preparation Dickens brought to these readings reflected the same meticulous discipline he applied to his writing. He rehearsed extensively before each tour, marking up his prompt copies with detailed annotations indicating precisely where to pause, where to raise or lower his voice, where to quicken the pace for dramatic effect. He treated the selection and editing of passages for performance as a serious literary and theatrical craft in its own right, condensing and adjusting his original prose to work effectively as spoken performance, sometimes spending weeks refining a single reading before he considered it ready to present before a paying audience. Managers who worked with him during these tours described a man of extraordinary professional discipline, arriving early, checking every detail of the venue and lighting, treating each performance with the same seriousness he might have brought to opening night of an important play. The financial rewards were considerable, and Dickens, ever conscious of his responsibility to provide for his large family and increasingly for Ellen Ternan as well, found the income from these tours difficult to turn away, even as the physical toll mounted. He was, by this stage of his career, one of the wealthiest authors in the world, yet the same restless drive that had once pushed him to escape the shame of the blacking warehouse continued to push him toward ever greater achievement and ever greater income, an impulse that friends increasingly worried had become less about genuine financial need and more about a deep, perhaps unresolvable psychological need to keep proving himself against some inner measure of adequacy that no amount of external success could ever fully satisfy. Friends and family who saw him during and after these grueling tours expressed growing concern. He reported increasing exhaustion, periodic dizziness, and, by the mid-1860s, symptoms that in retrospect suggest a series of small strokes or related circulatory problems, symptoms he largely ignored or minimized, driven by the same restless, almost compulsive need for activity and audience connection that had characterized him since childhood. Doctors who examined him during this period expressed private concern, but Dickens, ever the man who could not sit still, refused to substantially curtail his reading schedule, even as his body began sending increasingly clear signals that the pace could not continue indefinitely. On the 9th of June, 1865, an event occurred that would leave a lasting mark on Dickens's health and psychological state for the remainder of his life. Dickens, travelling by train from France back to England along with Ellen Ternan and her mother, was aboard when the train derailed at Staplehurst in Kent, after crossing a section of track where workers had removed rails for repair, apparently misjudging the train's actual schedule. Several carriages plunged from a bridge into the riverbed below. 10 passengers were killed and dozens more seriously injured in the wreck. Dickens's own carriage remarkably remained precariously suspended rather than falling completely, and after ensuring the safety of his travelling companions, he climbed out and spent the following hours moving among the wreckage, helping injured passengers, comforting the dying, and, by his own later account, working with remarkable composure amid scenes of extraordinary horror, carrying water to the wounded in his top hat when no proper containers could be found. Only after the immediate crisis had passed did Dickens remember that he had left the manuscript pages of his current novel, Our Mutual Friend, inside the wrecked carriage, and he climbed back into the precarious wreckage to retrieve them, a decision that, in retrospect, reveals much about the depth of his lifelong identification with his work, that even amid a scene of genuine tragedy and human suffering, some part of his mind remained fixed on the ongoing creative project that had become, in a very real sense, as essential to his identity as breathing itself. The Staplehurst disaster left Dickens with what today would very likely be recognised and treated as post-traumatic stress, though no such diagnostic framework existed in his era. He developed a lasting fear of rail travel, reported persistent nervousness and anxiety when travelling by train for the remainder of his life, and friends noted a marked and permanent change in his overall composure following the crash. He rarely spoke publicly about the disaster in detail, but private letters reveal that he continued to experience symptoms of distress connected to the event for years afterward, and several biographers have suggested that the physical and psychological shock of Staplehurst likely accelerated the broader decline in his health that became increasingly apparent over the following 5 years. In the immediate aftermath of the crash, before help arrived from nearby towns, Dickens moved methodically among the injured and dying, offering water, comfort, and whatever small practical assistance he could provide, drawing on a composure that surprised even those who knew him well, though he later admitted privately that his hands shook uncontrollably for hours afterward, once the immediate crisis had passed. He wrote to a friend some days later describing the scene in vivid, harrowing detail: the moans of the wounded, the strange stillness of the dead, the particular horror of a catastrophe that had struck without any warning on what had, moments before, been an entirely ordinary journey. He noted with something like wonder his own capacity to remain calm and useful amid the wreckage, even as he privately confessed that the experience had shaken him more deeply than almost anything else in his adult life. The presence of Ellen Ternan and her mother among the survivors added an additional layer of private anxiety to the aftermath, since Dickens was, at the time of the crash, still attempting to keep the details of his relationship with Ellen entirely private from the public. He was required to give testimony at the subsequent inquiry into the disaster, and managed with considerable care to protect Ellen's presence from public scrutiny during these proceedings, a small but telling illustration of just how much energy Dickens continued to expend, even amid genuine physical and psychological trauma, on maintaining the careful separation between his public reputation and his private life. What he could not know, as he tended to the wounded beside the wrecked train that June afternoon, was that he had exactly 5 years remaining to live, years he would spend characteristically refusing to slow down, continuing to write, continuing to perform, continuing to push himself forward, even as his body increasingly signalled that the accumulated strain of decades of relentless activity, compounded now by genuine physical trauma, had begun to exact its final and inevitable cost. By the late 1860s, Dickens's doctors were expressing serious, increasingly urgent concern about his health. He experienced periods of severe exhaustion, difficulty walking on his left side, occasional confusion, and other symptoms that modern medical assessment strongly suggests represented a progressive series of small strokes affecting his circulation and neurological function. His close friends noticed that his famously energetic, quick movements had slowed, that his handwriting had changed, that the man who once walked 20 miles without apparent fatigue now struggled with far shorter distances. Letters from this period, written to close friends like John Forster, reveal a man increasingly aware of his own mortality, occasionally reflective in ways that felt new for someone who had spent most of his life in perpetual, forward-driving motion, rarely pausing long enough to consider his own limits. And yet, characteristically, Dickens continued to push forward. In 1867 and 1868, against the explicit advice of his physicians, he undertook an extensive reading tour of the United States, travelling through brutal winter conditions, performing to enormous crowds in city after city, Driven by both financial considerations, he wished to secure his family's future, and by that same restless, performance-hungry temperament that had defined him since childhood, American audiences, remembering an earlier, less flattering set of travel writings Dickens had published decades before, greeted him this time with overwhelming warmth and enthusiasm, filling theatres to capacity, waiting in long lines overnight to secure tickets to his performances. The tour exacted a severe toll. Dickens reported significant physical deterioration throughout his months in America, difficulty eating, persistent leg pain, and an alarming pulse rate that alarmed the physician who travelled with him for portions of the tour. He returned to England in the spring of 1868 significantly weakened, and yet, remarkably, he almost immediately began planning a further series of farewell readings across Britain, as though the very idea of stopping, of finally resting after nearly 4 decades of continuous driving activity, remained somehow unthinkable to him. In 1869, during this final British reading tour, Dickens collapsed on stage in Preston, experiencing what his doctors now recognised clearly as a warning sign of serious cardiovascular danger, likely a small stroke, affecting his speech and the left side of his body. His physician insisted, in the strongest possible terms, that the remaining tour dates be cancelled, and for perhaps the first time in his adult life, Dickens reluctantly agreed to substantially curtail his professional activities, a concession that friends recognised as deeply uncharacteristic, and that spoke to the genuine severity of his declining condition. Even this warning, however, could not fully still his restless energy. Dickens turned his attention, during his final year of life, to a new novel, The Mystery of Edwin Drood, a dark, atmospheric murder mystery unlike anything else in his published work, and he also insisted on undertaking a final, shortened series of 12 farewell readings in London during the early months of 1870. Readings that friends and family watched with growing alarm as they observed his visibly diminished stamina and increasingly laboured performances. Those who attended these final London readings in the early months of 1870 often remarked, in letters and later recollections, on a peculiar, poignant quality to the performances, a sense that they were witnessing something they would remember for the rest of their own lives, even if they could not have articulated exactly why. Dickens's voice, though weaker than in earlier years, retained its extraordinary expressive range, and his commitment to each character and scene remained undiminished, even as his physical movements grew visibly more careful and deliberate than the energetic performances audiences had enjoyed a decade earlier. Family members who attended these final performances later spoke of watching him with a mixture of pride and quiet apprehension, sensing, perhaps before Dickens himself fully acknowledged it, that these readings represented something closer to a genuine farewell than the merely theatrical framing of the phrase might have suggested. His very last public reading took place on the 15th of March, 1870, at St. James's Hall in London. At its conclusion, Dickens addressed the audience directly, his voice reportedly breaking with emotion, telling them that from these garish lights he now vanished forevermore, a farewell that proved, in ways the audience could not fully have anticipated that evening, more permanent and poignant than perhaps even Dickens himself fully realised as he spoke the words. In his final years, Charles Dickens lived at Gads Hill Place, the very house near Chatham that his father had pointed out to him during their walks together when Charles was a small boy, telling him that if he worked hard enough, he might one day own such a house himself. Dickens had purchased the property in 1856, a quiet triumph that closed a remarkable circle stretching back nearly 50 years, and he had spent considerable time and expense improving and expanding the house, over the following years, creating gardens, a tunnel beneath the road connecting to a small wooded area he called his wilderness, and a Swiss chalet in the grounds where he did much of his final writing. It was here, in this house that represented the fulfillment of a boyhood dream born from his father's hopeful, half-serious promise, that Dickens spent his last, quieter months working steadily, though with diminished energy, on the mystery of Edwin Drood, walking in his gardens when his strength permitted, and spending time with the children and grandchildren who visited, by all accounts finding in these final months a measure of the domestic peace and stability that had eluded him during the more turbulent decades of his fame. Visitors to Gads Hill during these final months described a household that, despite Dickens's evident physical decline, retained much of the warmth and lively hospitality that had characterized his homes throughout his adult life. He still enjoyed entertaining guests, still delighted in showing visitors around his gardens and the small Swiss chalet where he wrote, a gift from a French admirer that had been shipped to England in pieces and reassembled in the grounds, connected to the main house by the underground tunnel he had built beneath the public road. He continued to take his beloved dogs on shortened versions of his once legendary walks, and neighbours in the surrounding villages grew accustomed to the sight of England's most famous author strolling the country lanes near his home, often stopping to speak with the local residents, with the same genuine warmth and curiosity about ordinary people's lives that had characterized his entire career. He continued to correspond extensively with friends, family and admirers, maintained his lifelong love of long walks, though considerably shortened now from the 20-mile expeditions of his younger years, and by June of 1870 seemed, to those around him, to be in reasonably stable health, all things considered, though the accumulated damage of decades of relentless work and the lingering effects of his stroke and the Staplehurst trauma remained, invisibly, very much present within him. On the 8th of June, 1870, Charles Dickens spent the day working in his Swiss chalet at Gads Hill, continuing his progress on the mystery of Edwin Drood, a novel that would, as it turned out, never be completed, its central mystery left permanently unresolved, a fitting and haunting final note from a writer who had spent his entire career constructing intricate, carefully resolved plots for the entertainment and moral instruction of his enormous readership. That evening he came in from the chalet for dinner with his sister-in-law Georgina Hogarth, who had lived with the family for many years and had become an essential presence in the household following Dickens's separation from Catherine. During the meal, Dickens began speaking, and those present noticed his words growing strange and disconnected, his speech faltering in a way that alarmed Georgina immediately. Moments later, he collapsed. He was moved to a couch in the dining room, where he remained, unconscious, through the night and into the following day, the 9th of June, 1870, surrounded by family members who had been urgently summoned to his bedside. He never regained consciousness. In the early evening of that day, exactly 5 years to the day after the Staplehurst rail disaster, Charles Dickens died, at the age of 58, in the house that represented the fulfillment of his father's long-ago promise, surrounded by the family who had gathered in those final hours to say their goodbyes to a man whose imagination had given voice and dignity to so many of the forgotten and overlooked figures of his age. News of his death spread with remarkable speed across England and soon after around the world. The response was extraordinary in its depth and breadth, extending far beyond the literary and social circles one might expect to mourn a famous author. Ordinary readers, factory workers, shopkeepers, and, by numerous contemporary accounts, children in the poorest neighbourhoods of London, were reported to have expressed genuine grief upon hearing the news, a testament to just how deeply and personally Dickens's characters and stories had embedded themselves in the emotional lives of readers across every level of Victorian society, from the wealthiest drawing rooms to the humblest tenement flats, uniting a remarkably broad cross-section of English society in a single shared moment of collective mourning. Dickens had, in his will, expressed a clear preference for a quiet, private funeral, without pomp or excessive ceremony, a wish that reflected both his personal modesty about such matters and perhaps his lifelong discomfort with excessive formality of any kind. His family attempted to honour this wish, arranging what was intended to be a small private burial. However, the overwhelming public desire to honour him made a truly private observance essentially impossible. He was buried in Westminster Abbey, in the Poets' Corner, alongside many of England's greatest literary figures, an honour arranged despite the family's initial intentions for a quieter resting place, reflecting the national recognition of his towering literary significance. Though his family had arranged for a private burial ceremony, attended by only a small number of close relatives and friends, the Abbey authorities left the grave open for several days afterward to accommodate the enormous number of ordinary members of the public who wished to pay their respects. Thousands of people filed past the open grave over those following days, many of them, by contemporary newspaper accounts, weeping openly, laying flowers, standing in respectful, grieving silence before the resting place of a man they had never met but who had, through his novels, become an intimate and beloved presence in their lives. Newspapers across the world carried extensive obituaries and tributes in the days following his death, many written by fellow authors who had known him personally, reflecting at length on his extraordinary career and his equally extraordinary personal warmth. Queen Victoria herself, upon hearing of his death, expressed genuine sorrow at the loss of a writer whose work she had long admired, and tributes poured in not only from England but from across the United States, continental Europe, and the wider English-speaking world, a testament to just how thoroughly his fame had transcended national boundaries during his lifetime. In the weeks that followed, his final unfinished novel, The Mystery of Edwin Drood, was published with the chapters he'd completed, leaving readers to forever debate and speculate about how the central mystery might have been resolved had Dickens lived long enough to complete it. A strange and fitting final gift from a writer who had spent his career constructing intricate plots, now leaving his very last one permanently, tantalizingly open. Scholars, enthusiasts, and mystery writers have continued, in the century and a half since, to propose their own theories and even complete their own endings for the unfinished novel, a peculiar and ongoing tribute to the strength of the narrative hook Dickens had constructed even in these final weakened months of his life. The epitaph eventually placed upon his grave was simple and direct: Charles Dickens, born 7th February 1812, died 9th June 1870. No elaborate tribute, no lengthy inscription cataloguing his achievements, just his name and the 2 dates that bracketed a life of extraordinary transformation, from a shamed 12-year-old boy pasting labels in a blacking warehouse to one of the most beloved and influential writers in the history of the English language. In the century and a half since his death, Charles Dickens's influence on literature, language and culture has, if anything, only continued to grow. His novels have never gone out of print, a remarkable feat for any writer, and they continue to be read, studied, adapted, and cherished by millions of readers across the world, translated into dozens of languages, taught in classrooms from London to Tokyo to Sao Paulo. Consider how thoroughly Dickens's imagination has woven itself into the fabric of everyday modern life, often in ways we no longer even recognise as originating with him. Every time someone calls a miserly person a Scrooge, they are invoking a character Dickens created in 6 intense weeks during the autumn of 1843. Every time someone describes bureaucratic delay as Dickensian, or refers to grim, exploitative conditions using that same adjective, they are acknowledging the lasting power of his social criticism. The phrase, "Please, sir, I want some more," spoken by the starving orphan Oliver Twist, remains instantly recognisable to millions who have never read the novel itself, a testament to how deeply certain scenes and phrases from his work have embedded themselves in broader cultural consciousness. Beyond specific phrases and characters, Dickens's broader influence on the craft and business of storytelling has proven equally enduring. His pioneering use of serialized publication, releasing novels chapter by chapter over many months, helped establish narrative techniques, including the strategic use of cliffhangers and suspense, that continue to shape how modern television series, streaming shows, and serialized fiction of every kind are structured and paced. His genius for creating vivid, instantly memorable characters, distinguished by distinctive speech patterns, physical mannerisms, and names that seem to capture their essential nature, established a template for character creation that novelists and screenwriters continue to study and emulate to this day. His influence on the modern celebration of Christmas remains particularly striking. The warm, family-centred, charitable spirit that Dickens celebrated so memorably in A Christmas Carol helped shape and popularise Christmas traditions that many of us now take entirely for granted, and the book remains, nearly 2 centuries after its publication, a staple of holiday celebrations around the world, adapted into countless film, television and stage versions, performed and read aloud in households and theatres every December. Universities across the English-speaking world continue to offer entire courses devoted solely to his novels, and academic journals dedicated exclusively to Dickens studies continue to publish new research, new interpretations, and new biographical discoveries well into the present day, a level of sustained scholarly attention matched by only a small handful of writers in the entire history of English literature. Literary scholars continue to study and debate Dickens's work with undiminished energy, examining his complex and evolving treatment of gender, his sometimes troubling depictions of certain ethnic and religious groups that reflect the prejudices of his era and his complicated personal life, including his painful treatment of Catherine during their separation. Modern biographers and critics have worked to present a fuller, more honest portrait of Dickens, one that honours his genuine achievements and his sincere commitment to social reform, while also acknowledging his very real flaws and contradictions, presenting him not as a flawless moral saint, but as a complicated, brilliant, deeply human figure whose extraordinary gifts existed alongside genuine failings, much like any other person, however extraordinary his talents. Dickens's influence extends deeply into the world of film and television as well, shaping the very grammar of dramatic adaptation in ways later creators rarely trace back to their true origin. His novels have been adapted for the screen more times than perhaps any other author's body of work, from early silent film versions produced in the earliest days of cinema, through countless subsequent film, television, and stage adaptations continuing into the present day. Directors and screenwriters have returned again and again to his stories, drawn by their vivid characters, strong emotional arcs, and enduring moral resonance, proof that the storytelling instincts Dickens developed through years of serialized publication translate remarkably well into visual media that did not even exist during his own lifetime. His impact on the English language itself extends well beyond the specific phrases already mentioned, Dickens is credited by linguistic historians with either coining or significantly popularising numerous words and phrases still in everyday use, and his gift for creating memorable character names — Scrooge, Pip, Miss Havisham, Uriah Heep, Fagin — has given the language a whole vocabulary of shorthand references for particular human types and behaviours, understood immediately even by many people who have never opened one of his books. Few writers in the history of any language have left so deep and lasting an imprint on everyday speech. Educational institutions, museums, and literary societies dedicated to preserving and studying his legacy exist across England and around the world. The Charles Dickens Museum, located in the London house where he lived while writing Oliver Twist and Nicholas Nickleby, welcomes visitors from around the globe each year. Gads Hill Place, the house that fulfilled his father's boyhood promise, still stands, a physical monument to the remarkable arc of his life's journey. His birthplace in Portsmouth has similarly been preserved as a museum, allowing visitors to stand in the very rooms where the story of Charles Dickens began. Perhaps most remarkably, Dickens's influence extends into the very structures of how modern societies think about poverty, childhood, and social responsibility. His unflinching depictions of exploited children and neglected orphans helped shift public sentiment during his own lifetime, contributing to a broader Victorian reform movement that gradually produced improved child labour laws, expanded educational access, and increased public attention to the conditions of workhouses and prisons. While Dickens alone certainly cannot be credited with these broader legislative and social changes, historians generally agree that his novels played a genuine and measurable role in shaping the moral climate that made such reforms politically possible, giving faces and names, however fictional, to suffering that might otherwise have remained an abstract statistic to England's comfortable classes. Modern readers continue to discover, often with some surprise, just how relevant Dickens's central concerns remain. The gap between wealth and poverty, the human cost of institutional indifference, the redemptive possibility of genuine compassion extended across class lines, the particular vulnerability of children in a world designed by and for adults. These themes, rooted so deeply in Dickens's own childhood experience, have proven remarkably durable, resurfacing in new forms across each subsequent generation of readers who find, in his crowded, vivid, deeply human novels, something that continues to speak directly to their own moment in history, a rare and lasting achievement for any writer of any era. There is something particularly moving when we step back and consider the whole shape of Charles Dickens's life, in the image of that 12-year-old boy standing at his table in the Blacking warehouse, pasting labels through the long hours of the afternoon, watching the Thames flow past the grimy window, uncertain whether his family's fortunes or his own would ever recover. He could not have known, in that moment of shame and quiet despair, that the very pain he was enduring would become, transformed through decades of disciplined and prolific creative labour, the foundation of an artistic legacy that would outlast him by centuries, that would comfort and move and entertain millions of people he would never meet, in countries he would never visit, in a future he could not have imagined. Here was a man who never received the university education that many of his literary contemporaries took for granted, who taught himself shorthand through sheer determination as a teenager, who built, entirely through talent and relentless effort, one of the most extraordinary literary careers in the history of the English language. Here was someone who carried a secret shame for his entire adult life, sharing the full truth of his Blacking warehouse months with almost no one, and yet who transformed that very shame, again and again, into stories that gave voice and dignity to the poor, the forgotten, the abandoned children of Victorian England who might otherwise have remained entirely invisible to history. Dickens once wrote, in a passage from one of his novels that seems, in retrospect, to capture something essential about the deeper purpose behind his own remarkable life and career, that no one is useless in this world who lightens the burden of it for anyone else. It is worth sitting with that sentiment for a moment as we bring this long story to its close. Charles Dickens spent his life through his novels, his public readings, his tireless charitable work and his relentless advocacy for the poor and vulnerable, doing exactly that, lightening burdens, giving voice to suffering that might otherwise have gone unheard, and reminding his enormous readership, across an entire empire and beyond, that compassion, generosity, and moral seriousness mattered every bit as much as wealth, status, or worldly success. Consider, too, the particular grace of the circle his life traced from beginning to end. He began in a modest naval town, the son of a well-meaning but financially reckless clerk. He endured, as a child, a period of shame and hard labour that he could barely bring himself to speak of even in his most private moments. He built, through nothing but talent, discipline, and an almost unimaginable capacity for sustained work, one of the greatest literary careers in human history, and he ended his days in the very house his father had once pointed out to him as an impossible dream, surrounded by family, his name already secure in the permanent affection of readers across an entire nation and, in time, the entire world. It is the kind of arc that, if it appeared in one of his own novels, might almost seem too neatly resolved, too perfectly circular to be believed. And yet it happened exactly this way, verified across countless letters, memoirs and historical records, a true story every bit as moving as anything his imagination ever produced. The boy who once feared he'd been abandoned to a life of shame and poverty became, in the end, a man whose stories continue to comfort readers falling asleep in homes around the world, nearly 2 centuries after his birth, this very story among them. Perhaps there is something fitting, something quietly poetic in that particular continuity, that a man whose own childhood was marked by such fear and uncertainty in the darkness would go on to become, across the generations, a gentle and steady presence in the quiet hours before sleep, for so many people, in so many homes, so very far from that small window overlooking the Thames. It is worth remembering, as we close this particular story, that Charles Dickens was never a simple man, and that his greatness lay not in any flawless perfection, but in his remarkable capacity to transform genuine suffering into genuine compassion, to take the raw material of his own difficult beginnings and shape it, patiently, across 4 decades of disciplined work, into something that continues to soften hearts and open eyes long after his own eyes closed for the final time at Gads Hill. Whatever his private failings, and they were real, the public gift he left behind, a body of work that still makes readers laugh, still makes them weep, still moves them toward greater kindness for the vulnerable people around them, remains one of the most enduring and generous legacies any single human being has ever left to the world that came after him. Thank you for spending this time with the story of Charles Dickens. If you enjoyed this journey through his remarkable life, consider subscribing for more long, calm biographies like this one, and feel free to leave a comment about whose story you would like to hear told next. Until then, rest well, sleep peacefully, and good night.